I didn't expect a slap. Not in an evening gown, not in front of 130 of Manhattan's most powerful guests, and definitely not with a champagne flute still in her other hand. The crystal cracked against the marble floor as silence swallowed the Hawthorne Club. Aubrey Sterling, dripping in diamonds and entitlement, had just struck me across the face. Her voice trembled with venom. You don't deserve that penthouse. You're not one of us. Give me the keys, Camille, or I'll make sure everyone here knows the truth about you. But the truth was on my side. I looked her dead in the eye, lifted my chin, and, without a word, walked away in front of every stunned guest, my cheeks stinging and my dignity intact. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in my car outside the Hawthorne Club, my heart pounding as I pressed call on the number I hadn't dialed in over a year. Graham, it's Camille. Bring the contracts. That evening had begun like any other charity gala at the Hawthorne Club. The Manhattan skyline glittered through floor-to-ceiling windows. Champagne flowed, and the air was thick with expensive perfume and even more expensive promises of philanthropy. I'd spent an hour getting ready in my grandfather's penthouse, my penthouse now, slipping into a midnight blue gown that fell simply from my shoulders, a single pearl pendant at my neck, my mother's. No diamonds, no flash, just elegance, as Thomas Winters had taught me. Invisible wealth protects you from visible vultures, he used to say, adjusting his modest watch before we'd attend functions together. The memory made me smile as I pinned my hair back, revealing the gentle angles of my face that reminded everyone of him. I was his granddaughter in every way that mattered. I hadn't planned to attend the gala. These events were Aubrey's territory now. Stages for her to parade her supposed philanthropy while wearing jewelry that could fund entire school districts. But the Foundation for Urban Green Spaces needed representation, and as the quiet force behind its funding, I couldn't decline. The moment I entered, I felt eyes on me. 18 months since my last appearance. 18 months since my grandfather's funeral. 18 months of rumors spreading that I was squandering his fortune, or that I was living beyond my means in a penthouse I couldn't afford. Camille Winters, a silver-haired woman on the board of 3 major charities, took my hands. How lovely to see you again. We've missed your grandfather's wisdom at these gatherings. Thank you, Mrs. Harrington. I've missed him too. Are you still living in that magnificent penthouse? Such a treasure. Before I could answer, a familiar laugh cut through the air. Aubrey Sterling, in a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, surrounded by her usual entourage. Our eyes met briefly across the room. Her smile faltered, then returned with doubled intensity as she whispered something to the man beside her, who glanced my way with poorly disguised curiosity. I moved through the crowd, accepting quiet greetings, ignoring whispers. The director of the foundation approached me, relief evident in his eyes. Camille, thank you for coming. The donors have been asking if you'd say a few words about Thomas's vision for urban green spaces. I didn't prepare anything, just a minute or two. Your grandfather's name still carries weight, and we need to secure funding for the East Side project. I nodded reluctantly. Public speaking wasn't my strength, but I could manage a brief statement about why converting concrete jungles into community gardens mattered, especially in neighborhoods that needed healing. I was heading toward the small stage when a hand gripped my arm, manicured nails digging slightly into my skin. The scent of Aubrey's signature perfume hit me before her words did. Well, the ghost of Manhattan passed, she said, her voice honeyed with artificial warmth. I almost didn't recognize you without your gardening gloves. Hello, Aubrey. The orchid centerpieces are beautiful. Your choice? Of course. Unlike some people, I don't pretend to be what I'm not. I'm involved in every detail. She sipped her champagne, eyes roaming over my simple gown. Still playing the modest heiress? It's getting old, Camille. I'm not playing anything. I moved to step around her. Wait, she said, lowering her voice. We need to talk about the penthouse. I paused. What about it? It's become an embarrassment. Everyone knows you can barely afford to maintain it. My offer still stands. I'll take it off your hands for a very generous price. The building deserves someone who can honor its legacy. I felt a flicker of anger but kept my expression neutral. The building is doing fine under my care, thank you. Is it? Because I've heard the board is concerned about certain irregularities in the maintenance fees. And those rumors about tax issues? There are no irregularities or tax issues, Aubrey. Now, if you'll excuse me, her fingers tightened around my arm. Don't walk away from me. I've been patient, Camille. I've given you time to accept that you don't belong here anymore. That penthouse should be mine. I would open it for charity events, showcase it properly, not hide it away like you do. The penthouse isn't for sale, especially not to you. Her perfectly composed face cracked slightly. You think you're so special because Thomas picked you? He was old and sentimental. He didn't understand what that property means to people like us. People like you mean? Something dangerous flashed in her eyes. Give me the keys, Camille. Tonight. I have buyers waiting to see it tomorrow. I almost laughed. You can't possibly be serious. Dead serious. Hand them over or I'll tell everyone about the mortgage you took out, about the funds you've been misappropriating from Thomas's trust. Those are lies, and you know it. Her voice rose slightly, drawing attention from nearby guests. Everyone knows you're drowning, Camille. Playing at being one of us when you can barely keep up with the property taxes. It's pathetic. People were watching now. I could feel their eyes, sense their eagerness for drama amid the polite conversation and charitable platitudes. Lower your voice, Aubrey. This isn't the place. This is exactly the place. She stepped closer. You don't deserve that penthouse. You're not one of us. Give me the keys, Camille, or I'll make sure everyone here knows the truth about you. There's nothing to know, I said quietly, and nothing to hide. That's when it happened. Her face contorted with rage, her arm swung back, and before I could process what was happening, her hand connected with my cheek in a sharp, stinging slap. The champagne flute in her other hand slipped, shattering on the marble floor. The music seemed to stop. Conversations died mid-sentence. 130 of Manhattan's elite stood frozen, witnessing Aubrey Sterling's public assault on Thomas Winter's granddaughter. My cheek burned, but I didn't touch it. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply looked her in the eye, lifted my chin slightly, and walked. Away. Through the crowd, past the shocked faces, out the massive doors, and into the elevator. Only when I reached my car did I allow my hands to shake. I pressed them against the steering wheel, took 3 deep breaths, and reached for my phone. The number was still in my favorites, though I hadn't needed to use it for over a year. I pressed call. Graham Delaney speaking. Graham? It's Camille. Bring the contracts. There was a brief pause. All of them? All of them. The Hawthorne Club, 30 minutes. I'll be there. I ended the call and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. A red mark was forming on my cheek, but my eyes were clear. Grandfather's eyes, everyone said. The eyes that could see through pretense and performance. It's time, I whispered to my reflection. Then I started the car and drove around the block, parking where I could see the entrance to the Hawthorne Club. And I waited. Thomas Winters raised me to understand the difference between noise and substance. Money talks, he'd say, adjusting his simple tie before heading to his architecture firm. But wealth whispers? My earliest memories are of his drafting table, the smell of pencil shavings and tracing paper, his steady hand drawing the skyline that would define parts of Manhattan. He designed buildings that lasted, structures that stood quiet and dignified among the flashier towers that rose and fell with changing tastes. Just like he stood, quiet and dignified, among the flashier personalities of New York high society. My parents' accident happened when I was 7, one icy bridge, one moment of misfortune, and I became Thomas Winters' sole focus. He never remarried after my grandmother's death years earlier, and suddenly his spacious penthouse became home to a grieving child and her stuffed animals. He adapted without complaint, converting his home office into my bedroom, installing bookshelves at my height, teaching me to tend the rooftop garden he'd designed himself. Plants teach patience, he explained, helping me pot my first tomato seedling. And patience builds character. I grew up between 2 worlds. The privileged sphere of Manhattan's elite, where my grandfather's name opened doors, and the simple life he insisted on maintaining despite his success. We lived in the penthouse he had designed decades earlier, at the top of one of his favorite buildings. But we drove modest cars, wore quality clothes without designer labels, and donated substantial sums to causes that mattered without attending galas to celebrate our generosity. That's where Aubrey Sterling and I first crossed paths, at a fundraiser for children's arts education when we were both 12. She arrived in a custom-designed dress dripping in her mother's diamonds, despite her age, while I wore a simple blue dress my grandfather had helped me choose. "That's it?" she'd asked, eyeing my outfit with disdain. "My mother says your grandfather designed half the buildings in this neighborhood." "Not half," I'd replied. "Just the good ones." She didn't like that answer. or me. But our social circles overlapped enough that we remained in each other's orbit through our teenage years. She went to a prestigious private school. I attended the public magnet school for arts and sciences. She summered in the Hamptons. Grandfather and I spent summers renovating historic houses in small towns across New England. She collected designer handbags. I collected plant specimens. When college came, Aubrey went to an Ivy League school her family had attended for generations. I chose a state university with an excellent landscape architecture program, much to the horror of my grandfather's social peers. She could go anywhere, I overheard Mrs. Harrington telling another board member at a charity function. Such a waste of the Winters name. But grandfather defended my choice. Camille goes where her passion leads her. That's the true Winters legacy. Not buildings or bank accounts, but the courage to build something meaningful. I returned to New York after graduation, working for a landscape design firm that specialized in urban renewal projects, transforming neglected spaces into community gardens and sustainable parks. I could have lived in the penthouse, but instead rented a small apartment in Brooklyn, taking the subway to work, living within, my earned means rather than my inherited wealth. Grandfather understood. You're building your own foundation, he said with pride. Strong foundations require time and honest work. Meanwhile, Aubrey had returned from college directly to a seat on her father's investment firm board, a position created specifically for her. She became a fixture in society pages, attending every opening, every benefit, every exclusive gathering, always photographed in the latest designs, always quoted with the perfect soundbite about whatever cause was fashionable that season. Our paths crossed occasionally. Each time her smile grew tighter, her comments sharper. She'd ask about my little gardens with the same tone someone might use to discuss a child's finger painting. I would ask about her latest charity project, genuinely curious, only to receive vague answers about raising awareness and leveraging influence. Grandfather watched these exchanges with quiet amusement. She's never understood that true influence doesn't need to announce itself, he told me after one particularly tense interaction at a museum opening. Your gardens will outlast her galas. Then came the diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer, advanced. 6 months, maybe less. Grandfather faced it with the same quiet dignity with which he'd faced everything else in his life. I need you to listen carefully, Camille, he said one evening as we sat in his study, looking out at the city lights. There will be people who think they deserve what I've built, people who believe wealth should be worn and displayed. I know, I said softly. The penthouse comes to you. The firm goes to my partners. The Winters Foundation will need your guidance. But most importantly, he took my hand. My reputation goes to you. How you conduct yourself after I'm gone will tell people who I really was. That's a heavy responsibility. Only if you try to be someone you're not. He smiled. Be Camille Winters. That's all I've ever wanted. He slipped away 3 months later, peacefully, in the penthouse he'd designed, with the city he'd helped shape spread out below his windows. The funeral was well attended. Business associates, charity directors, society figures, and surprisingly, many ordinary people, doormen, maintenance workers, secretaries, and assistants who had known Thomas Winters as a man who remembered their names, asked about their families, and treated them with genuine respect. Aubrey attended, of course. Dressed in black Chanel, she air-kissed my cheek and murmured something about such a distinguished man, and impossible to replace. Her eyes, however, kept drifting to the gathering around us, assessing who was present, who was watching, who was important. After the funeral came the reading of the will. Simple and straightforward, just like grandfather himself. The penthouse and its contents to me. Generous provisions for his longtime housekeeper and driver. Structured gifts to various charities. And the Winters Foundation for Urban Development and Green Spaces, with me as the primary trustee. You're not planning to live in the penthouse, are you? Aubrey asked at the reception. Afterward, her tone suggesting the very idea was absurd. It's far too much for one person. And the maintenance alone. I haven't decided, I replied, though I already knew I would move in. Not because of its value or prestige, but because it was home. The place where I'd learned to draw at my grandfather's knee, where I'd pressed flowers between heavy architecture books, where I'd celebrated every birthday with a small chocolate cake and a single candle. Well, when you realize it's impractical, call me first. She pressed her business card into my hand. My offer will be more than generous. That was 18 months ago. I moved into the penthouse the week after the funeral. continued my work with the landscape firm while taking on my new responsibilities with the Winters Foundation. Lived quietly, modestly, focused on extending my grandfather's legacy through urban renewal projects and community gardens in neighborhoods that needed beauty and hope. And all the while, Aubrey Sterling watched, waited, and fumed. The penthouse she coveted, the crown jewel of Manhattan real estate, with its private rooftop garden and unobstructed views, remained in my understated hands. The Winters, name she envied, continued to open doors, even when attached to a woman who wore simple pearls and focused on sustainable urban development rather than social climbing. Her campaign began subtly. Whispers at charity events about my financial situation, questions raised in board meetings about the foundation's direction. Then came the concerns about the penthouse maintenance, followed by increasingly aggressive offers to purchase it. Each time I politely declined. 2 months ago, she escalated. A formal letter arrived claiming to represent concerned residents of the building, suggesting the penthouse was being underutilized and that maintenance issues were affecting other units. The letter was vague on specifics, but heavy on implications that I was out of my depth. Graham Delaney, my grandfather's longtime banker and the executor of his estate, called the day after the letter arrived. Aubrey Sterling is behind this, he said without preamble. She's been asking questions about the title transfer, looking for irregularities. There aren't any irregularities. Of course not, but she's persistent, and she has connections. What should I do? Nothing for now. Keep living your life. I'll handle the legal aspects. So I did. I continued tending the rooftop garden. Oversaw the foundation's newest project converting an abandoned lot in Queens into a community space. Drove my 7-year-old BMW to work. Ignored the whispers and stares. Until tonight. Until the slap that changed everything. As I sat in my car outside the Hawthorne Club watching the entrance, I touched my cheek gently. The sting was fading, but something else was taking its place. A quiet resolve. A certainty that had eluded me since grandfather's death. It was time to stop being invisible. Time to show Aubrey Sterling and everyone else exactly what the Winters legacy truly meant. And Graham Delaney, with his briefcase full of contracts, was about to help me do exactly that. I watched Graham's town car pull up to the Hawthorne Club precisely 27 minutes after my call. Even from a distance, I could see the determined set of his shoulders as he stepped onto the sidewalk, leather briefcase in hand. At 62, Graham Delaney moved with the assurance of a man who had spent decades managing old Manhattan fortunes, and the secrets that often came with them. He didn't look around. He didn't hesitate. He simply straightened his tie and walked through the ornate doors, a financial guardian entering the battlefield. I gave him 5 minutes, then followed. The Hawthorne Club's lobby was a study in old-world opulence. Marble floors, mahogany paneling, and discreet security that recognized wealth before faces. The guard nodded as I passed, no questions asked, despite my earlier dramatic exit. The elevator attendant, an older gentleman who had known my grandfather, gave me a subtle look of concern, but said nothing as he took me back to the ballroom level. The moment I stepped off the elevator, I could hear Aubrey's voice carrying from the main hall. She was at the podium, champagne in hand. A fresh glass, I noted, delivering what was clearly meant to be the evening's keynote address about her foundation's work with disadvantaged children. Commitment to visibility matters. These children need to see themselves represented in spaces like this one. That's why I've personally ensured that our fundraising remains high profile, bringing attention to... She faltered mid-sentence as the ballroom doors opened. All heads turned. Not to me. I had slipped in quietly along the wall, but to Graham, who stood framed in the doorway, briefcase in hand, expression professionally neutral, but eyes scanning the crowd until they found me. With a slight nod in my direction, he walked purposefully toward the center of the room. Aubrey recovered quickly. As I was saying, visibility in philanthropy is essential. Now, if you'll excuse the interruption, Ms. Sterling, Graham's voice, though not loud, carried the weight of authority that silenced the room. I believe you were discussing visibility. Perfect timing. The crowd parted for him as he approached the podium. I remained by the wall, watching expressions shift from confusion to curiosity. Mrs. Harrington caught my eye across the room, her eyebrows raised in silent question. I gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Excuse me," Aubrey said, her composure slipping. "We're in the middle of an important fundraising address." "Indeed. Fundraising for children. Noble work." Graham set his briefcase on a nearby table and opened it with deliberate movements. "I won't take much of your time. I'm simply here to address certain claims made earlier this evening regarding the Winters property holdings. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several guests turned to look at me, then quickly averted their eyes when they realized I was watching them. This is hardly the venue for real estate discussions, Aubrey said, her voice artificially light. Perhaps we could speak privately after. You didn't request privacy when you publicly assaulted Ms. Winters, Graham replied, his tone still so courteous but unmistakably firm. In fact, you seemed quite intent on making your claims about the penthouse visible to everyone present. Another murmur, louder this time. Phones discreetly appeared in hands around the room. Manhattan's elite loved their charity galas, but they loved scandal even more. Graham removed several documents from his briefcase and laid them on the table. Ms. Sterling has made repeated claims regarding the ownership and financial status of the Winters penthouse, he continued. Since she chose to make these claims publicly, I believe the corrections should also be public. Aubrey's face had gone pale beneath her perfect makeup. This is inappropriate and unnecessary. I have here the original deed to the penthouse property, Graham continued as if she hadn't spoken, holding up a document encased in a protective sleeve. Transferred cleanly and legally to Ms. Camille Winters upon Thomas Winters' death, free and clear of any liens, mortgages, or financial encumbrances. He placed it down and lifted another document. I also have documentation of all maintenance payments for the building, made promptly and in full, for the past 18 months under Ms. Winters' ownership. Another document. And here we have the financial statements for the Winters Foundation, showing all charitable distributions made under Ms. Winters' trusteeship, including, he paused for effect, the substantial annual donation that maintains the Hawthorne Club's historic facade restoration fund. This revelation sent a visible shockwave through the room. Several board members exchanged glances. The Hawthorne Club's facade restoration had been their pride for years, a pet project highlighted in every annual report. Graham wasn't finished. Most interestingly, I have here a series of formal inquiries made by Ms. Sterling or her representatives to the property management company, the city records office, and even to certain banking officials, seeking evidence of financial impropriety where none exists. Aubrey stepped down from the podium, moving quickly toward Graham. That's enough. This is slander. It's documentation, Ms. Sterling. He held up one final paper, including this rather concerning document that appears to be an attempt to fabricate a lien against the property using falsified signatures. Our forensic document specialists found it quite interesting. The room had gone completely silent. Every eye was on Aubrey, whose perfectly manicured hand now trembled visibly against her black evening gown. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice had lost its commanding edge. This is obviously some misunderstanding, perhaps the most relevant fact, Graham continued, gathering the documents back into his briefcase, is one that answers Ms. Sterling's earlier demand. She asked Ms. Winters to give her the keys to the penthouse. He closed the briefcase with a definitive click. That would be legally impossible, given that Ms. Sterling's own residence, the one she currently occupies, is itself owned by the Winters Property Trust. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Aubrey's face went from pale to ashen. That's a lie, she whispered. The Sterling family has leased that property from the Winters Trust for 3 generations, Graham said simply. The arrangement was made between your grandfather and Thomas Winters' father. The terms were always extremely favorable, well below market rate, in fact. Mr. Winters considered it a courtesy between old families. I chose that moment to step forward, moving through the stunned crowd until I stood beside Graham. Not too close to Aubrey. I had no desire to provoke another outburst, but close enough that everyone could see us together. A united front. Thank you, Graham, I said quietly. He nodded, then addressed the crowd one last time. The Winters family has always conducted its business and philanthropy with discretion and integrity. Ms. Camille Winters continues that tradition. I trust this clarifies the situation for everyone present. With that, he picked up his briefcase and moved to stand slightly behind me, present but yielding the floor. I looked at Aubrey, whose perfect facade had crumbled completely. Mascara smudged beneath one eye. Her lips trembled. For the first time since I'd known her, Aubrey Sterling looked vulnerable, exposed. And in that moment, I realized I had a choice. I could humiliate her further, could expose every rumor she'd spread, every lie she'd told, every manipulation she'd attempted. The audience was primed for it, phones still discreetly recording, eyes avid for the final blow in this unexpected social drama. Instead, I simply said, The Foundation's work with urban green spaces continues. Anyone interested in seeing real results rather than just hearing about them is welcome to visit our newest community garden in Queens next weekend. The children who tend the vegetables there would love to show you their work. I turned to leave, then paused and added softly, for Aubrey alone. The lease on your residence is secure. My grandfather would never have wanted it otherwise. The tears that filled her eyes weren't from gratitude. They were from the shame of being shown mercy when she had shown none. Her carefully constructed image of power had been dismantled not with cruelty, but with simple truth. As Graham and I walked out of the Hawthorne Club together, the silence behind us slowly gave way to a rising tide of whispers that would reshape Manhattan's social landscape by morning. Are you all right? Graham asked as we reached the street. I touched my cheek, still faintly warm from Aubrey's slap. I think I am. For the first time in 18 months, I think I really am. Dawn broke over Manhattan as I stood on the penthouse rooftop garden, watching the city wake beneath a sky streaked with pale gold and lavender. I hadn't slept. After leaving the Hawthorne Club with Graham, I'd returned home and spent hours walking through each room of the penthouse, touching my grandfather's books, studying the architectural models he'd kept, reconnecting with the space not just as property but as heritage. The garden had always been his pride, an oasis 15 stories above the street, with carefully selected plants that could withstand Manhattan's challenging microclimate. I ran my fingers along the smooth wooden handle of his favorite trowel, left exactly where he'd placed it after his final afternoon of gardening. What would you have done? I asked aloud, looking out at the skyline he'd helped shape. The rising sun caught the glass and steel of buildings he'd designed, making them glow like beacons among their neighbors. My phone had been buzzing all night, first with texts from people who'd witnessed the confrontation, then with links to social media posts about the Hawthorne showdown, and finally with calls from reporters seeking comment. I'd silenced it hours ago, unwilling to feed the story further. The penthouse doorbell rang at precisely 7:30 a.m. Through the security monitor, I saw Mrs. Chen, the building's most senior resident and head of the condo, bored. At 85, she moved slowly, but her mind remained razor-sharp. She had been one of my grandfather's closest friends and fiercest critics. "You should be sleeping," she said when I opened the door, her accent still strong despite 60 years in New York. "After such drama, young women need rest for their complexion." I couldn't sleep, I admitted, stepping aside to let her enter. She moved past me with her cane tapping lightly on the hardwood floor, headed straight for the kitchen where she began opening cabinets with the familiarity of someone who had visited often. "Your grandfather kept good tea," she said, finding what she was looking for. "Sit, I will make." I knew better than to argue. I sat at the kitchen island while she prepared 2 cups of oolong tea with practiced movements. "The building is talking," she said, her back to me. "All-night text messages. Mrs. Harrington called emergency board meeting for this afternoon." "I'm sorry for the disruption." Mrs. Chen turned, fixing me with a stern look. "No apologies for truth. That Sterling girl," she made a dismissive gesture. "Always too loud, too shiny. No substance." She placed a steaming cup before me and took a seat on the adjacent stool, her small frame perched with perfect posture despite her age. "Your grandfather worried about you," she said, after taking a careful sip. "Not about money or property, about your heart." I wrapped my hands around the warm cup. "What do you mean?" "He built things to last, not just buildings, connections, trust, respect." She tapped her cane against the floor for emphasis. "He feared you inherited his quietness but not his certainty, that you would let others define your worth." The tea was strong and slightly bitter, exactly how my grandfather had always prepared it. He never said that to me. Of course not. He was proud. Wanted you to find your own way. She set her cup down with a decisive click. "Last night you found it." We sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, sipping tea as the morning light strengthened across the kitchen. "The board will want statement," Mrs. Chen finally said, "about Sterling Girl's claims and the ownership situation." "What should I tell them?" Her eyes crinkled slightly. "Truth, simply told, like your grandfather would." She stood, adjusting her silk scarf, "and perhaps mention the garden expansion. Plans. The West Terrace needs attention." After she left, I showered and changed into simple linen pants and a blue blouse, then called Graham. He answered immediately as though he'd been waiting for my call. "The damage control is underway," he said without preamble. "Sterling's father issued a brief statement distancing the family from her personal grievance. Several board members have already reached out to reaffirm their support for the foundation. And Aubrey? A slight pause. She's gone silent. Left her apartment early this morning with several suitcases. The doorman says she mentioned something about the Hamptons. Running away, I murmured, more to myself than to Graham. Retreating to regroup, he corrected. People like Aubrey Sterling don't disappear for long. They simply change tactics. He was right, of course. The social battlefield might have tilted in my favor after last night, but the war for narrative control was just beginning. What would Thomas advise? I asked. Graham's chuckle carried through the phone. He'd say to go about your day as planned. Focus on the work that matters. Let the gossips exhaust themselves while you build something worthwhile. The Queen's Garden project opens next week, I said, making a decision. I think I'll spend the day there instead of attending the emergency board meeting. I'll handle the board, Graham promised. You handle the legacy. After our call, I gathered my landscape plans and headed to the garage where my old BMW waited faithfully. As I pulled into traffic, my phone rang through the car's speaker system. The caller ID showed Olivia Reed, my closest friend since college, and the one person who had consistently supported my choice to honor my grandfather's legacy in my own quiet way. Please tell me you've seen the video, she said without greeting. What video? I've turned off social media. Oh my God, Cam, there are at least 3 different angles of Aubrey slapping you, and then the most beautiful karma moment when that silver fox of a banker showed up with receipts. It's already being called the Manhattan takedown of 2025. I winced. That's exactly what I didn't want. Well, too late. You're trending. But here's the thing. People are actually on your side. Like, overwhelmingly. All those years of Aubrey's performative charity work, people saw through it. They were just waiting for someone to call her bluff. I didn't want to call anyone's bluff. I just wanted to be left alone to do my work. That's why it's so perfect. Olivia's voice rose with excitement. You weren't trying to expose her. You were just standing your ground. That makes it authentic. People respond to authentic. As I navigated through midtown traffic, I considered Olivia's words. Had never sought attention or validation from Manhattan society. Had always been content to work quietly on projects that mattered, just as my grandfather had taught me. But perhaps there was value in visibility sometimes. Not the flashy, self-promoting kind Aubrey cultivated, but the kind that showed strength through dignity and purpose. Where are you heading? Olivia asked, breaking my reverie. Queens. The Community Garden Project. Perfect. Stay focused on real work while Aubrey probably has her publicist calling crisis management firms. She paused, then added more seriously. I'm proud of you, Cam. Thomas would be too. Those words stayed with me as I crossed the Queensboro Bridge, leaving Manhattan's gleaming towers for the more textured landscape of a borough in transition. The community garden site had once been an abandoned lot surrounded by chain-link fence and concrete. Now, after months of work by the foundation and neighborhood volunteers, it was transforming into something beautiful. Raised beds filled with vegetables and flowers, a small playground made from sustainable materials, benches where elderly residents could sit and watch children play. As I parked and gathered my plans, I noticed several people already working despite the early hour. Maria Vasquez, the neighborhood coordinator, waved when she saw me approach. You're the last person I expected to see today, she said, wiping soil from her hands. Thought you'd be handling the fallout from last night. I felt my face flush. You heard about that? Heard? Girl, my cousin works security at the Hawthorne Club. The whole neighborhood knows. She gestured around at the other volunteers, who were trying not to stare too obviously in my direction. We're all just glad somebody finally showed those Manhattan types what real class looks like. I spent the entire day in Queens, losing myself in the simplicity of soil and seedlings. Maria and the neighborhood volunteers tactfully avoided mentioning the previous night's drama directly, but their increased warmth told me they'd heard every detail. An elderly Dominican man pressed fresh empanadas into my hands at lunchtime. A teenager who normally avoided eye contact asked if I'd help her design a butterfly section for the garden. By late afternoon, my phone had stopped its incessant buzzing. I'd responded only to Graham's updates about the board meeting, which had gone predictably dramatic but ultimately supportive, and a brief text to Mrs. Chen confirming I would attend next week's resident gathering. As the sun began to dip behind the Queen's skyline, casting long shadows across our newly planted beds, Maria handed me a cup of strong coffee from her thermos. So what happens now? She asked, leaning against the garden's handcrafted cedar fence. With the garden? We finish the irrigation system next week, then not with the garden. She gave me a knowing look. With you. That penthouse. Your grandfather's world. You've spent 18 months trying to exist in both places without fully belonging to either. I sipped the coffee, its bitterness anchoring me to the present moment. I'm not sure what you mean. Yes, you are. Maria's directness was one of the reasons I'd chosen her to lead this project. You come here in your expensive car wearing clothes that try to look inexpensive. You work harder than anyone but never talk about the foundation that's funding everything. You're hiding in both worlds. Her words stung with their accuracy. I'd been living a divided existence, maintaining my grandfather's penthouse and social obligations while trying to distance myself from the wealth and privilege they represented, never fully embracing either reality. My grandfather believed in quiet impact, I said finally, doing good work without seeking recognition. And that's beautiful, Maria nodded. But after last night, quiet isn't an option anymore. You're visible now. The question is, what will you do with that visibility? I looked around at what we'd created together. This vibrant green space emerging from concrete neglect. Children playing on equipment made from sustainable materials. Seniors teaching teenagers how to recognize when vegetables were ready for harvest. A true community forming around shared purpose. I don't want to become Aubrey, I said softly. Everything for show, nothing with substance. There's a lot of space between hiding and performing, Maria replied. Your grandfather understood that. Those buildings he designed, they're not invisible. They make a statement. They just make it through quality and longevity, not flash and spectacle. The parallel was so clear I almost laughed. Of course, Thomas Winters hadn't truly been invisible. He'd simply chosen his visibility carefully, ensuring it reflected his values rather than his ego. I have board meetings tomorrow, I said, making a decision. I think it's time the Winters Foundation had a clearer voice about what we stand for. Maria smiled and clinked her coffee cup against mine. That's my girl. Just remember who you're really building for. She gestured around at the garden. These people don't care about Manhattan drama. They care about having safe spaces that make their lives better. I won't forget, I promised. Night had fallen by the time I returned to Manhattan. The penthouse windows glowed with the soft light I'd left on that morning, a habit I'd developed to make the space feel lived in when I returned. As the elevator opened directly into the foyer, I noticed something unexpected, the subtle scent of lilies. On the entry table sat an arrangement I hadn't ordered, white lilies and blue hydrangeas in a simple crystal vase, my grandfather's favorite combination. I approached cautiously, looking for a card. The small envelope contained a handwritten note in elegant script. Camille, your grandfather once told me that true character reveals itself not in victory, but in how we choose to use it. Your restraint last night showed more of Thomas in you than any building ever could. Eleanor Harrington. Mrs. Harrington, one of the most influential voices on Manhattan's charity circuit, and a woman who had previously regarded me with polite skepticism. The gesture brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I carried the flowers to the kitchen island and sat looking at them. For a long moment, thinking about how my grandfather would have responded to the events unfolding around his legacy. He had always balanced privacy with purpose, modesty with impact. My phone chimed with a new message. I expected another social media alert or press inquiry, but instead found an email from the editor of Urban Design Quarterly, a respected publication in the architecture and urban planning world. Ms. Winters, in light of recent events highlighting your family's continued influence on Manhattan real estate and philanthropy, we would be interested in featuring the Winters Foundation's community revitalization projects in our upcoming issue on sustainable urban spaces. Your grandfather was one of our most respected contributors. Would you consider continuing that tradition? I stared at the request, feeling a strange sense of alignment clicking into place. This wasn't tabloid interest in society drama. This was recognition of the work itself, the gardens, the community spaces, the living legacy that mattered far more than real estate value or social standing. I typed a simple reply. I would be honored. The Foundation's current Queens project would make an excellent case study in community-led design. Setting down my phone, I walked to my grandfather's study, a room I'd preserved exactly as he'd left it, down to the half-finished sketch on his drafting table. His collection of architectural models lined the bookshelves, miniature versions of the buildings that had made the Winters name synonymous with thoughtful urban design. I ran my fingers along the spine of his journal, a leather-bound volume where he'd recorded thoughts about projects, sketched preliminary ideas, and occasionally reflected on the principles that guided his work. Opening it to a random page, I found an entry from 15 years earlier. met with Sterling again about lease terms, insisted on maintaining the original agreement despite market changes. Some traditions matter more than profit margins. Relationships between families should transcend quarterly reports. The entry confirmed what Graham had revealed at the Hawthorne Club. My grandfather had intentionally kept Aubrey's family in their home at below-market rates, out of respect for history and connection. A quiet kindness Aubrey had either never known about or chosen to ignore in her campaign against me. I continued, flipping through the journal, finding another entry from more recent years. Took Camille to see the Queen's site today. She immediately saw potential others missed. Where they saw abandoned buildings, she envisioned community gardens. Where they saw liability, she saw gathering places. She has the eye, not just for design, but for purpose. When she looks at space, she sees people first, structures second. That's the true Winters legacy. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I hadn't known he'd written this, hadn't realized he'd seen my passion so clearly, valued it so deeply. I closed the journal and placed it carefully back on the shelf, then walked to the wall of windows overlooking the city. Lights twinkled across the skyline, many of them illuminating buildings my grandfather had designed or influenced. For the first time since inheriting it, I truly felt I belonged in this penthouse, not because of its value or status, but because it was the perfect vantage point from which to continue the work that mattered. The height provided perspective. The history provided purpose. My phone chimed again. A text from Graham. Board votes unanimous in support of you continuing as Foundation trustee. Sterling family representatives abstained but did not oppose. Consensus is that last night's unfortunate incident should be considered resolved. Planning to announce Queen's Project expansion at next month's fundraiser? I smiled and typed back, yes. And I think it's time we invited some new voices to that fundraiser. The community leaders actually implementing our projects should be the ones explaining their impact. His reply came quickly. Thomas would approve wholeheartedly. Looking out at the city my family had helped build, I made a silent promise. To my grandfather, to myself, and to the communities we served. The Winters name would continue to stand for something meaningful, but perhaps with a slightly more visible presence than before. Not for ego or acclaim, but because some truths deserved to be seen. A week passed, then two. The initial media frenzy about the Hawthorne showdown gradually faded into background chatter, supplanted by fresher scandals and newer dramas. I declined all interview requests, issued a single measured statement through the foundation about focusing on community projects rather than personal matters, and returned to a semblance of normalcy, albeit a new normal shaped by increased visibility. The Queen's Garden project opened to the community with a simple ribbon-cutting ceremony. No celebrities, no press releases, just neighborhood residents and the volunteers who had built it together. I stood in the background, watching children race to the swings while their parents admired the vegetable beds already sprouting early summer produce. This is how change actually happens, Maria said, appearing beside me with 2 paper cups of horchata from her cousin's food truck. Not with galas and speeches, but with dirt under fingernails and communities taking ownership. My grandfather would say both have their place, I replied, accepting the sweet drink gratefully. The galas fund the fingernail dirt. She laughed. True enough. Speaking of galas, I heard you're hosting something next month? A fundraiser for the Foundation's next phase. And yes, you and the other project leaders will be the featured speakers, not me. Putting the actual workers on display? How revolutionary. Her teasing smile softened the words. The Manhattan elite won't know what hit them. That's precisely the point. Later that afternoon, I returned to the penthouse to find Graham waiting in the lobby, his expression uncharacteristically hesitant. We need to talk, he said as we rode the elevator upward. Something unexpected has developed. In the penthouse, he declined my offer of tea and went straight to business, removing a folder from his briefcase. Aubrey Sterling has returned to the city, he began, watching my reaction carefully. Her father's firm issued a press release this morning announcing her new role heading their community investment initiative. I raised an eyebrow. Sounds suitably vague. Indeed. But this arrived by courier an hour ago. He handed me an envelope bearing the Sterling Investment Group's embossed letterhead. Inside was a formal letter addressed to me personally, not to the foundation. Dear Ms. Winters, recent events have highlighted misunderstandings between our families that deserve resolution. Sterling Investment Group is launching a significant funding initiative for community development projects in underserved neighborhoods, an area where the Winters Foundation has demonstrated expertise and commitment. I would like to propose a collaborative approach that honors both our family's legacies while creating meaningful impact for New York communities. Would you be willing to meet privately to discuss potential partnership opportunities? Sincerely, Aubrey Sterling, Director, Community Investment Initiative. I read the letter twice, trying to detect the hidden agenda between its carefully composed lines. It could be genuine, Graham offered, though his tone suggested skepticism. The Sterling family's reputation took a hit after the Hawthorne Club incident. They may see partnership with you as a reputation rehabilitation strategy, or it could be another tactic to gain access to foundation resources and contacts. Graham nodded. That's my concern. Though attacking you publicly didn't work, so perhaps she's trying a different approach. I set the letter on the coffee table, staring at Aubrey's signature. Flowing, dramatic, taking up more space than necessary. Everything about her in miniature. What would my grandfather do? I asked, more to myself than to Graham. Thomas believed in second chances, he replied thoughtfully. But he also believed in clear boundaries. The penthouse doorman called up then, announcing another visitor. Mrs. Chen, who arrived minutes later carrying a small, exquisitely wrapped package. For garden opening, she explained, handing it to me. Couldn't attend. Doctor appointments. I unwrapped it carefully to find a miniature jade plant in a handcrafted ceramic pot. Symbolizes growth and prosperity, she said, nodding approvingly as I placed it on the windowsill. Also very hard to kill, even for busy people. Her shrewd eyes noted Graham's presence and the letter still sitting on the coffee table. Business troubles? Not exactly, I hesitated, then handed her Aubrey's letter. More of a dilemma. She read it quickly, her expression giving nothing away. When she finished, she returned it with a small humph sound. Sterling family, she said, lowering herself carefully onto the sofa. 3 generations I've known them. Always same pattern. Create problem, then offer solution that benefits them more than others. Graham nodded in agreement. That's my concern as well. But, Mrs. Chen held up one finger, collaboration has advantages. Keep enemies visible. Control narrative. I considered her words. There was wisdom in maintaining proximity to potential adversaries, in establishing the terms of engagement rather than merely reacting. You're suggesting I accept the meeting? With conditions, Mrs. Chen emphasized. Your location, your terms, and, she tapped her cane for emphasis, bring witnesses. Sterling girl smiles to your face, takes notes behind your back. After Mrs. Chen left, Graham and I drafted a carefully worded response accepting a meeting, but suggesting it take place at the Queen's Garden site rather than either of our offices. To provide context for any potential collaboration, the letter explained. 2 days later, Aubrey agreed to the location but requested a preliminary coffee meeting to establish parameters before the site visit. She suggested a small cafe in Greenwich Village, neutral territory, far from the Manhattan Power centers where we were both known. I arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a table near the window where sunlight illuminated the entire space, leaving no shadows for hidden agendas. The cafe was busy enough to prevent private conversations from being overheard, but not so crowded as to require rushed discussion. Aubrey arrived precisely on time, dressed in a casual elegance that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent but was designed to appear effortless. Gone were the statement jewelry and dramatic makeup from the Hawthorne Club gala. This version of Aubrey was subdued, approachable, carefully calibrated to present contrition without weakness. Thank you for meeting me, she said, sliding into the chair opposite mine. Her voice lacked its usual performative confidence. I wasn't sure you would. My grandfather believed in hearing people out, I replied simply. A flicker of something, irritation, respect, crossed her face before she controlled it. Yes, Thomas was always fair that way. More than fair, actually. The waitress arrived and we both ordered. Herbal tea for me and oat milk latte for Aubrey. When we were alone again, she folded her hands on the table, a gesture that seemed rehearsed in its humility. I owe you an apology, she said, meeting my eyes directly. My behavior at the Hawthorne Club was inexcusable. I let personal feelings override professional judgment, and I'm deeply sorry for that. I nodded, acknowledging the apology without immediately accepting it. What personal feelings exactly? Her perfect composure faltered slightly. She hadn't expected the direct question. That's complicated. She took a breath, recalibrating. I've always admired what your family built. The Winters name opens doors that even sterling money sometimes can't. When Thomas passed and everything went to you, someone who seemed to want no part of that world, it felt wasteful. So you tried to take it. She winced. I tried to convince myself I would be a better steward of his legacy, that I understood the social ecosystem, the connections needed to keep his influence alive. Our drinks arrived, creating a momentary pause in the conversation. I used the time to study her, the careful construction of her reformed image, the calculated vulnerability. Why should I believe anything has changed? I asked finally, stirring honey into my tea. Aubrey's carefully constructed facade cracked slightly at my direct question. She wrapped her manicured fingers around her latte, buying time. I understand your skepticism, she said finally. I wouldn't trust me either. Yet you're asking for a partnership. Not exactly. She took a small sip of her drink. I'm asking for a chance to learn. The Sterling name needs reinvention. And not just because of recent events. I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. My father's firm has been losing major clients to more progressive investment groups. Companies focused on sustainable development, ethical funding models. The areas where your foundation excels. She leaned forward slightly. The truth is, Camille, what I did at the Hawthorne Club was just the public culmination of, years of jealousy. Jealousy? The word surprised me. Of what? Of how easily you wear your influence. How naturally you command respect without demanding it. Her voice lowered. How your quiet approach achieves more actual impact than all my galas and photo ops combined. I studied her face, searching for the manipulation behind the confession. But all I found was something unexpected. Genuine discomfort, the struggle of someone unused to admitting weakness. The Sterling Investment Group needs to evolve, she continued. And I need to prove, to my father, to our board, and yes, to Manhattan society, that I'm capable of substance, not just spectacle. And you think associating with the Winters Foundation will accomplish that? I think learning from you might. She met my eyes directly. I don't expect friendship, Camille. I don't even expect forgiveness. But I am proposing a limited collaboration that would benefit communities while allowing both our families to maintain their legacies. I sipped my tea, considering her words. The proposal itself made strategic sense. Her family's investment capital combined with our foundation's community connections could accelerate projects that might otherwise take years to fund. But trusting Aubrey Sterling seemed dangerously naive after everything that had happened. Why not approach another foundation? There are dozens doing similar work. Her laugh held no humor. After the Hawthorne Club? No reputable organization will touch the Sterling name without significant reassurance. You, on the other hand, emerged from that disaster with your reputation not just intact but enhanced. So I provide reputation laundering, and you provide capital. She winced at my bluntness. I'd prefer to call it mutual benefit. Your projects get faster funding. We rebuild our credibility through actual good work. I considered what Maria had said about visibility and purpose, what Mrs. Chen had advised about keeping potential adversaries close, what my grandfather might have done when faced with an opportunity disguised as a risk. I'll consider it, I said finally. But I have conditions. Relief washed across her face. Name them. First, you personally visit each community site before any announcement, meeting the local leaders without cameras or publicity. She nodded. Reasonable. Second, funding. Comes without Sterling branding or naming rights. The communities themselves decide how recognition is handled. This one clearly stung her ego, but she agreed. Third, you attend our board meetings as an observer for 3 months before any formal partnership is announced. Learn how we operate, why we make the decisions we do. And if after 3 months you still don't trust me, then we both walk away. No hard feelings. She considered this, then extended her hand across the table. I accept your terms. I shook her hand briefly, noting how different this exchange felt from our previous encounters. Less performance, more purpose. As promised, Aubrey arrived at the Queen's Garden site the following week, dressed inappropriately for the environment in cream-colored pants and a silk blouse, but making visible efforts to engage with the community leaders. She asked thoughtful questions, took notes, and refrained from offering unsolicited opinions, a remarkable departure from her usual approach. Over the following weeks, she attended foundation board meetings, sitting quietly in the background, observing our decision-making process. Several times I caught her looking surprised or thoughtful when discussions focused on community impact rather than donor recognition or publicity opportunities. After the second month of her observation period, Graham pulled me aside after a particularly productive meeting. She's either the most patient saboteur I've ever encountered or she's genuinely trying to change, he admitted grudgingly. The Sterling Group has already quietly funded the South Bronx playground without any press release or naming plaque. People can change, I offered, surprising myself with the sentiment. Perhaps, but stay vigilant. His protective instincts remained firmly intact. Trust is earned over years, not weeks. The true test came 3 months later when the foundation hosted its annual fundraiser. Unlike previous years, this event was held not at the Hawthorne Club but at a renovated community center in Brooklyn, one of our completed projects. The guest list included traditional donors alongside community leaders, project volunteers, and local residents who benefited from the foundation's work. Aubrey arrived alone, dressed elegantly but appropriately for the venue. Throughout the evening, I watched her navigate conversations with both wealthy benefactors and neighborhood advocates, seeming equally comfortable with each. When Maria cornered her near the sustainable refreshment table, I moved within earshot, curious about their interaction. "So you're the famous Aubrey Sterling," Maria said, her tone making it clear she knew the entire history. "Camille is taking quite a risk trusting you." Aubrey didn't flinch. "Yes, she is. I intend to prove it's not misplaced." "Why should any of us believe that?" Maria pressed. "Your whole world is about appearance, not substance." "Because I'm learning that appearance fades," Aubrey replied with surprising candor. "My family has spent 3 generations accumulating wealth and influence, but what have we built that will outlast us? The Winters name is on half the city's most beloved spaces. The Sterling name is just on investment portfolios." Maria studied her for a long moment. "Pretty words. We'll see if actions follow." When it came time for the evening's presentation, I took a calculated risk. Instead of delivering the keynote address myself, I invited Aubrey to join me on stage. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Many recognized her from the Hawthorne Club incident, which had become something of a Manhattan legend. She looked momentarily startled but composed herself quickly and walked to the podium with measured steps. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began, looking out at the diverse gathering. "The Winters Foundation has always believed that true community transformation happens when different perspectives come together around shared purpose." Turned slightly toward Aubrey. "In that spirit, I've invited Aubrey Sterling to announce our newest initiative, a collaborative effort between our organizations that will accelerate community development in 5 underserved neighborhoods." Aubrey stepped forward, her expression serious and focused. "Thank you, Camille. Before I outline this initiative, I want to acknowledge something important." She paused, scanning the room. "Many of you witnessed my behavior toward Camille Winters several months ago. It was inexcusable, born of jealousy and a profound misunderstanding of what true impact looks like." The room went completely silent. No one had expected this public acknowledgement. The Sterling Investment Group is committing $50 million to community development projects over the next 5 years. These funds will be administered through the Winters Foundation's established community-led process, with no strings attached regarding naming or publicity. Gasps and whispers spread through the audience. "We're not doing this for recognition," Aubrey continued, her voice steady. "We're doing it because the Winters approach works. Because communities know better than corporations what they need. And because it's time the Sterling name stood for something more meaningful than market returns." As she outlined the specifics of the initiative, I watched the audience's reaction transform from skepticism to cautious optimism. When she finished, the applause was genuine. Not the polite society acknowledgement of wealth, but the authentic appreciation for meaningful commitment. Later that evening, as the event wound down, I found myself alone with Aubrey on the community center's small terrace, overlooking a garden our foundation had helped build. "You didn't have to give me that platform," she said quietly. "It would have been easier to keep me in the background." Easier, yes, but not more effective. I gestured toward the mingling crowds inside. They needed to see the change for themselves. "Do you believe it?" she asked, a rare vulnerability in her voice. "The change in me?" I considered the question carefully. "I believe you're trying. That's a start." She nodded, accepting this measured response. "My father called today after the transfer was completed. He said Thomas would have been proud of this collaboration." She hesitated. "Do you think that's true?" "I think," I said slowly, "that my grandfather believed in the power of transformed purpose. He would have approved of what we're building, even if he might have been surprised by who's helping build it." As we stood there in the gentle evening air, I realized something profound had shifted, not just between Aubrey and me, but in my understanding of my grandfather's legacy. Thomas Winters hadn't built lasting structures by avoiding risks or complications. He'd done it by engaging with them directly, finding common ground where others saw only division. The penthouse keys in my pocket felt different now, not a burden of inheritance or a symbol of status, but a tool for continuing meaningful work. And in giving Aubrey Sterling a path to redemption, I'd perhaps found the truest expression of the Winters legacy. 1 year after the Hawthorne Club incident, Manhattan society had largely moved on to fresher scandals and newer power struggles. The Sterling-Winters collaboration, as it came to be known in urban development circles, had completed its first 3 community projects: a renovated library in the Bronx, a playground in Queens, and a job training center in Brooklyn. Each opening had been marked by community celebration rather than society galas, with both Aubrey and I taking background roles while local leaders stood in the spotlight. Our unlikely partnership had evolved into a working relationship built on complementary strengths. Aubrey's financial acumen and connections opened doors that would have remained closed to the foundation alone, while our community-centered approach gave her family's investments meaning and impact beyond profit margins. We weren't friends. Too much history lay between us for that. But we had developed a professional respect that surprised everyone, ourselves included. On a crisp autumn morning, I stood in my grandfather's rooftop garden. My garden now, truly mine in spirit as well as deed, watching the sunrise illuminate the city skyline. The jade plant Mrs. Chen had given me had doubled in size, thriving in the eastern light just as she had predicted. My phone chimed with a message from Maria. Construction permits for Harlem project finally approved. Community meeting at 10 to finalize designs. I smiled, remembering the extensive negotiations that had preceded this victory. The Harlem Arts Center represented our most ambitious project yet, converting an abandoned warehouse into a multi-use space for performing arts, visual art studios, and youth education programs. The Sterling Group had secured the property at below market value, while the foundation had engaged local artists and educators in designing the space to truly serve community needs. As I prepared to leave for the meeting, the penthouse doorbell rang. The security monitor showed Graham Delaney, holding his ever-present briefcase and a newspaper. "Have you seen it?" he asked without preamble when I opened the door, extending the New York Times business section. The headline read, "Sterling Investment Group announces restructuring. Aubrey Sterling named president of new community development division. It's official." "Then," I said, scanning the article, "her father's finally recognized her work." Graham nodded. "William Sterling called me personally yesterday. Said the community division has outperformed their traditional investment branches 3 quarters running. Investors are specifically requesting their funds be directed toward the projects you two have developed." I set the paper aside. Good for her. She's earned it. Indeed. Though I never thought I'd hear you say that. His eyes crinkled with amusement. Thomas would be pleased with how you've managed these complicated relationships. Speaking of complicated, I said, the Hawthorne Club sent another invitation. They're renaming their main ballroom next month. Graham raised an eyebrow. After whom? Thomas Winters. Apparently, they've always considered him the embodiment of their values. I couldn't keep the irony from my voice. They're hoping I'll attend the ceremony. Will you? I hadn't decided. The Hawthorne Club represented everything my grandfather had participated in, but privately questioned. The performative philanthropy, the exclusivity masquerading as community. Yet it had also been part of his world. One of many. Spheres where he'd quietly exerted influence toward better ends. I'm considering it, I admitted. On one condition, that they open the event to representatives from each of our community projects. If they want to honor his name, they should meet the people continuing his work. Graham smiled. Brilliant. Using their desire for association to create actual connection? We'll see if they accept. I gathered my portfolio for the Harlem meeting. If not, the Winters name doesn't need another plaque. As we rode the elevator down, Graham mentioned casually, I saw Aubrey's name on the Hawthorne guest list as well. Not surprising. Her rehabilitation in society circles is nearly complete. True. Though I hear she declined chairmanship of 3 charity galas to focus on project implementation. He gave me a significant look. People do change, it seems. Sometimes, I agreed cautiously, when given the right incentives. The Harlem community meeting was scheduled in a local church basement that had served as our planning headquarters throughout the Arts Center development. As Graham and I arrived, I was pleased to see the room already filled with residents, artists, and educators. each stakeholder group represented in the decisions that would shape their neighborhood's future. Maria waved us toward the front where architectural renderings were displayed on easels. Perfect timing! We're about to review the final adjustments to the performance space. As discussions flowed around acoustics, accessibility, and multi-purpose usage, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Turning, I found Aubrey Sterling, dressed simply in black pants and a blazer. Her only jewelry, a pair of small pearl earrings not unlike those I often wore. "Congratulations on the promotion," I said, extending my hand. She shook it briefly. "Thank you. Though it's really our projects that earned it." She glanced around the room. This one especially. The board was impressed by the comprehensive approach. The community designed it, not us. Exactly. That's what I finally understood. Her expression held none of the performative emotion she'd once wielded like a weapon. "Listen, I wanted to tell you personally. I've declined the Hawthorne Club ceremony invitation. This surprised me. Why? It would be good visibility for the new division. That's exactly why." She lowered her voice. Slightly. "The Winters name deserves that recognition. The Sterling name needs to earn it differently. Through results, not ceremonies." I studied her face, finding sincerity where I once would have expected calculation. "That's very thoughtful, Aubrey. Besides," she added with the ghost of her old confidence, "I'll be in Chicago that week, meeting with potential expansion partners. Your community-led model has applications beyond New York." The meeting began in earnest then, with local artists presenting their vision for the space. I watched Aubrey listen attentively, taking notes, asking clarifying questions rather than imposing opinions, a transformation as significant as any building renovation we'd undertaken. Later, as Graham drove us back to Manhattan, he observed, "She's applied your lessons well." "They weren't my lessons," I replied, watching the city pass by. "They were Thomas's. I just happened to be the one who inherited them." "Speaking of inheritance," Graham said carefully, "the Foundation Board has been discussing expansion. The Sterling collaboration has increased our capacity significantly, and there are requests from other cities interested in implementing similar models. I'd been considering this possibility myself. What are you suggesting? That perhaps it's time for the Winters' influence to grow beyond New York, just as your grandfather's designs eventually shaped skylines across the country." The idea resonated with something that had been forming in my mind for months, a vision of my grandfather's principles applied to urban renewal nationwide, perhaps even globally. Not as a personal empire, but as a methodology, an approach to community development that centered the voices least often heard in planning processes. "I'll need to think about it," I said honestly. "Growth for its own sake isn't the Winters' way." "Of course," Graham smiled. "Take your time. The legacy isn't going anywhere." That evening, I stood again in the rooftop garden as the city lights came on below me, thousands of windows illuminating lives I would never know, but had perhaps influenced through the Foundation's work. I thought about how far I'd come since that night at the Hawthorne Club. From a woman slapped publicly for refusing to surrender her inheritance to someone whose approach to that inheritance had transformed not just communities, but former enemies. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. "Board voted yes on rooftop garden access. Residents can visit building gardens starting next month. Your grandfather would approve." I smiled, remembering one of my first initiatives after the Hawthorne Club incident, proposing that the building's shared rooftop space, long reserved for penthouse residents only, be redesigned as a community garden for all residents. It had taken months of gentle persuasion, architectural plans, and funding guarantees, but the board had finally agreed. Another text arrived, this one from Olivia. "Dinner tomorrow to celebrate NYT article and your general badassery? I'll bring the wine." I was typing my acceptance when the doorbell rang again. This time, the security monitor showed a courier, holding an envelope. It contained a formal letter from the Hawthorne Club, responding to my condition for attending their ceremony honoring Thomas Winters. "The Board of Directors is pleased to accept your suggestion of including representatives from the Foundation's community projects at the dedication ceremony. We believe this inclusion perfectly reflects Thomas Winters' commitment to bringing diverse perspectives together in service of a greater good." Attached was a revised event outline, including speaking slots for project leaders from each neighborhood and a display area for showcasing the Foundation's ongoing work. I set the letter on my grandfather's desk, my desk now, and looked at the architectural models surrounding me. Each represented not just a building, but a vision of how space could serve people, how design could foster community, how beauty and function could coexist in service of human needs. The penthouse no longer felt like a burden of inheritance or a symbol of privilege. It had become exactly what my grandfather had intended, a vantage point from which to see the broader landscape and identify where change was needed most. The height provided perspective, without separation, connection, without exposure. In the year since Aubrey Sterling had demanded my keys in front of Manhattan society, I had found the balance my grandfather had mastered, between visibility and substance, between tradition and innovation, between protecting legacy and extending its reach. I walked to the windows one last time before bed, taking in the glittering panorama of the city. Somewhere out there, Aubrey Sterling was likely reviewing financial projections for the community development division she now led. In Queens, Maria was probably finalizing tomorrow's presentation for the Harlem Project. In Brooklyn, children were sleeping soundly in homes adjacent to parks that once had been vacant lots. And here, in the penthouse Aubrey had coveted for its status, I stood, thinking not about its value, but its purpose, as my grandfather had taught me from the beginning. The truth had indeed been on my side that night at the Hawthorne Club, not just the truth about ownership and finances that Graham had revealed, but the deeper truth about what gives a legacy its power. Not possession, but purpose. Not status, but service. I ran my fingers lightly over the single pearl, pendant at my neck, my mother's, my most constant accessory. Simple, genuine, lasting. Like truth itself. The loudest people are often the weakest, I whispered to the city lights. And the quiet ones? We're just waiting for the right moment to speak the truth.